The development of my high school U.S. history curriculum relies heavily on Murf. I instruct LBLD students virtually. Language-based learning difficulties is referred to as LBLD. This means my students struggle with reading and writing because they are dyslexic. My students come from several other nations as well as the United States. In order to help students follow the material, I incorporate narrative and ambience into my reading level appropriate, high-interest content. Students learn from this and are better able to remember the material. They absorb it like a story because they can see it, hear it, and feel it. The text in this lesson group is original, and any images in the lessons have been cited. Music is either royalty-free or cited. My name is Shannon Greaves, and here is my entry.
The Reconstruction Era, a summary. After the American Civil War 1861 to 1865, the South had to heal and rebuild.
I was born in Dixieland, unreconstructed till the end in Carolina.
This period of time was called the Reconstruction Era, and it was an important part of the history of civil rights and racial freedom in the United States. During this troubled time, it was hard for the U.S. government to deal with the reunification of the 11 southern states that had left the Union, and the freeing of 4 million slaves. Many difficult questions had to be answered during Reconstruction. How could Confederate states rejoin the Union? How should former Confederate leaders be treated? And, perhaps most crucially, did freedom mean black people have the same legal and social rights as white people? The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was the first time in American history that black people had a say in how the country was run. But by the middle of the 1870s, white supremacist terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan were able to bring back many of the practices that helped white people rule over formerly enslaved people. Lincoln's 10% Plan. As the Union's chances of winning increased, America began reconstructing the United States before the Civil War ended. A few months after signing the Emancipation Proclamation, Abraham Lincoln revealed his 10% plan for Reconstruction in 1863. If 10% of Confederate state voters took an oath of loyalty to the Union before the war, they might form a new state government with the same constitutional rights and authorities. Lincoln believed the 10% plan would weaken the Confederacy, and so did Southern congressmen. So after none of the Confederate states agreed with the plan, Congress passed the Wade-Davis Act in 1864 instead. This statute required a majority of Confederate state citizens to swear loyalty before rejoining the Union. The term citizens referred to white and black males only. Presidential Reconstruction. After Lincoln was killed in April 1865, President Andrew Johnson started a period of 2 years called Presidential Reconstruction. Johnson's plan for reuniting the divided Union pardoned all white Southerners, except for wealthy plantation owners and Confederate leaders. White farmers were given back their constitutional rights and property rights, except slaves were not returned to them. To get back into the Union, former Confederate states had to end slavery, give up their right to secede, and pay the federal government for the costs, called reparations, of the Civil War. Once these conditions were met, the Southern state was reformed, and they were given control over their government and laws. However, once government changed hands, the Southern states created the Black Codes, a set of laws that severely limited the rights of Black people. Congressional or Radical Reconstruction. The Radical Republicans were a Republican Party faction founded in 1854 before the Civil War. They wanted slavery abolished immediately and permanently, and were opposed by moderate Republicans like President Abraham Lincoln and pro-slavery Democrats during the Civil War. This faction wanted to give former slaves civil rights immediately and without conditions. They fought for civil rights legislation after President Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction policies failed to stop exploitation of former slaves. They also opposed former Confederate military leaders running for office in Southern states and supported former slaves, known as freedmen. Moderate Republicans in Congress worked with Johnson to soften Reconstructionist policies, but Northerners opposed President Johnson's Reconstruction ambitions. In the 1866 midterm congressional elections, the faction won many seats. Since they now controlled the House and the Senate, Radical Republicans had nearly total congressional power because they could overturn Johnson's vetoes of their Reconstruction laws. This political uprising began a period of time called Congressional or Radical Reconstruction. Clarifying question: why were the Black Codes created? According to America's History through 1877, Volume 1, rich Southern plantation owners lost the equivalent of $3 billion in today's money when their slave property was emancipated. Former slaveholders realized they needed to absorb this cost while rehiring laborers to work the cotton fields. So, instead of feeding, clothing, and housing slaves, planters hired freed blacks to reclaim power over them. Former slaves worked and lived in conditions comparable to those they had undergone, mostly as domestic or agricultural labor. The 13th Amendment might have outlawed slavery, but it was allowed as a punishment for a crime. This loophole allowed Southern states to create a series of restrictive laws known as the Black Codes. Black Codes required black workers to sign contracts. Local authorities restricted black workers' activities, including religious meetings, and required them to possess written passes from their boss if they were not at their place of work. Under the Black Codes, local governments curfewed all black people and demanded white sponsorship. if they wanted to live in some areas. The Black Codes also prohibited Black people from performing certain tasks, being homeless, and recruiting Black children as apprentices. In Texas, for example, a Negro was someone who had at least one African great-grandparent. Negroes were not allowed to vote, seek for office, serve on juries, enlist in the local army, own weapons on plantations, start farms, or send their children to public schools. It was also illegal to marry someone of a different race. Punishment for violating the Black Codes included unreasonable fines and penalties, at least 5 years in prison or life imprisonment, or in some cases, death. During Reconstruction, Black people could not always afford the Black Code's fines and penalties. Rather than working to repay their debts, they would be charged with vagrancy, which would result in harsher fines and forced labor. Black people were viewed as second-class citizens everywhere. They were emancipated on paper, but most emphatically, not in practice.